I am going to be talking about how weightlessness can make strange fashion and our relationship with clothes. So I'm going to start with this, which is one of my students jumping on a trampoline. In order to show how drape is affected by weightlessness, because if you jump up and down, there's just a split second in the jump when you become weightless. And what I was doing with these students is testing to see how clothes drape differently when gravity isn't weighing them down onto the body. And this image is broadly representative of what I'm going to be talking about today, when we are at the dawn of the commercial space age, when it's possible to buy a trip into space. And we need to consider how culture, aspects of design, of art, all aspects of human culture and human experience need to be adapted for the environment in space, and specifically for the weightless environment. So that is human culture without Earth gravity. Weightlessness has forced us to reconsider things, and more so in the future as we spend more time in weightless environments, we will need to reconsider a lot more of what we take for granted in the fields of art and design, and particularly in the design and wearing of fashion. We'll need to look at how design is defamiliarized by weightlessness, and how designers can embrace the potential for weightlessness to defamiliarize design objects and the use of those objects. And in particular, of course, I'm focusing on fashion. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is drawn from my most recent book, Spaceware, which is due to be published in Russian at some point soon. So if you'd rather read the Russian rather than the English, that opportunity, I gather, is coming. So it's a bit of a shameless plug for the book there. And in summary, this is basically what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to start with the extraordinariness of gravity, specifically Earth gravity, because the theme of the conference is the unusual. And so the focus that will take us into fashion is the post-gravity experience, making strange and defamiliarization, and how the post-gravity experience leads to that. And then focus a lot more on how we need to reimagine fashion for that environment, considerations for future spacewear designers. So something called the post-gravity experience by creative practitioners, philosophers, who have experienced zero gravity, usually on just a zero gravity flight rather than in space, describe how the post-gravity experience recognizes that Earth gravity in particular is actually quite peculiar in the universe. It's uncommon. In space, weightlessness is the norm. And throughout human history, we have taken gravity for granted. We are so accustomed to it, we just assume this is, we take it for granted very much. And human experience has been shaped by gravity. Human experience, everything we do, everything we feel, is very much bound by the constraint of gravity, or dictated by gravity, particularly Earth gravity. But gravity is not a universal constant. And space travel means leaving behind the notion that Earth gravity is normal or usual. It is familiar to us, but it's not common in the universe. So those who've experienced weightlessness have this revelation that fundamentally changes their understanding of their everyday experience of gravity. They realize that verticality is subjective. It's not a universal constant. We're so bound up with these ideas about up and down, and that things have a top and a bottom. But that thinking only exists because we are accustomed to gravity giving everything the same orientation. We are used to things having this kind of vertical direction to them, and things being weighted downward onto a ground. And everything, all of our social interactions are kind of based around that, and many of our features of our design are as well. But in space, that's not the case. You might need to arbitrarily specify what is up and what is down. The post-gravity human therefore is more centered on self rather than on this universal idea of what is up and what is down and what is top and what is bottom. So in space, you are your own anchorage. You decide yourself what orientation you think is up and you think is down. It is very much an individual thing. Individuals determine their own planes of reference. And as a result, groundedness is not the norm. We're very much used to planting our feet on solid ground, being rooted to a surface, and even when we jump in the air, that journey is always going to take us back down again. We're always being pulled back down onto that ground. But that is not the experience necessarily in the wider universe. Astronauts often ground themselves through their hands by grabbing onto the sides of handholds and things. But generally in space, in outer space at least, there is no such thing as being grounded. Again, that's a very kind of human, earthbound experience. So in short, gravity is actually not normal. Gravity is strange, or specifically Earth gravity is strange. Earth gravity exists only here on Earth, and everywhere else there is different gravitational conditions. Sometimes gravity is weaker, sometimes people experience microgravity and feel weightless. And as in Earth orbit, gravity is experienced, or microgravity is experienced, so people feel weightless almost as if there is no gravity at all. So there's no such thing as normal gravitational conditions in the universe. There's just those conditions that are familiar to us and to us feel normal. Earth's gravitational conditions are actually extraordinary. So the more we venture away from Earth, the more we engage in long-distance space flight and explore new worlds, the more we begin to become an interplanetary species. The more we will come to appreciate and the more we will be forced to engage with different kinds of gravitational conditions. And that Earth gravity is just one of those many different gravitational conditions. And we will need to cater for those other conditions with design and with our interactions with design. There have been a small number of space tourists. One of them, Charles Simonyi, recalls his experiences as a commercial visitor to the International Space Station, having to constantly reorient himself. And navigating through the cabin, he found that your wall becomes your floor, and that one astronaut's floor might be another astronaut's ceiling, another astronaut's floor, making it difficult to do things like fit around a dining room table, because there is no up or down or correct orientation. And he describes how the dinner table is usually full of 4 or 5 people right side up, and then 1 or 2 people the other way up, using the ceiling as a floor. So those everyday experiences are made strange by the different orientations and the individual subjective orientations that people get themselves into. When we design, we are very much bound up in this idea that things have a top and a bottom and a right way up, that there is this agreed orientation for things. And we make things with stable bases, we make things with unstable tops, we make things that will almost naturally fall onto the correct upright position that has been designed for them, because we have designed them with a flat and stable base. Upright orientation is one of the key assumptions that we make when we design things. And for thousands of years, we've made objects with these stable bases that naturally rest in one orientation, that we consider to be the right way up. And even when we play around with that and have objects that are designed to be oriented at slightly odd angles, we still create a different kind of stable base for them so that they are upright in the way that they're intended to be. But in the commercial space age, we need to consider a different approach to this aspect of design. We also need to consider our own bodies and how they will interact differently with design objects in space. Since 1995, the Arts Catalyst has supported artists and performers and philosophers in works that engage in some way with the sciences, and that includes sciences related to space travel. A number of projects they've done attempt to demystify the private world that astronauts inhabit and cosmonauts on board parabolic flights. and they explore notions of groundlessness, defamiliarization of their earthbound practices. Choreographer Kitsu Dubois, who's pictured on the left here, became the first professional artist to explore weightlessness on board parabolic flights. And for her, the experience of weightlessness granted an extraordinary fluidity that she'd never experienced before, a fluidity of movement that she'd never felt anywhere on Earth. And it opened up her dance practice to new possibilities, but it also made her practice unfamiliar. As an experienced choreographer, she felt comfortable with what she was doing, and this just made everything unfamiliar and everything strange and unpredictable. And she realized that in order to perform in weightlessness, a dancer would have to completely relearn absolutely everything that they know about human movement and start again from scratch. So the experience of the human body is defamiliarized by weightlessness. A part of this is the changed relationship between the body and clothes. On Earth, we're constantly reminded of gravity, in part because of the weight of our clothes resting on our bodies, weight resting on our skin. We feel our clothes because gravity attaches those clothes to our skin. So we are constantly, throughout our clothed lives, reminded of the force of gravity through our clothes. And when cloth rests against our skin, we are constantly reminded of the presence of our clothes and also, by extension, the presence of gravity. In microgravity, however, clothes kind of billow out away from the body rather than hanging on it. And astronauts' experience tell us that as a result of clothes not draping against the body, garments not only look different in space but also feel different. And astronauts become so accustomed to living without clothes that when they come back they report feeling discomfort and even pain at wearing clothes because they've become so accustomed to nothing actually resting against their skin. And they've spent so long without the weight of the clothes against their skin. Those who've experienced weightlessness describe a loss of awareness of where their body ends and where their surroundings begin. So the relationship with not only our clothes but the wider environment beyond that is very much changed because there's a loss of these sensations that we take for granted when things are weighted against us or when we are weighted to our surroundings. So without the sensation of pressure on the skin stops playing the role of sensor between the interior of our body and the exterior, or between me and what is not me. And if those external limits of the body are not clear, then so too is the division between body and clothes and body and environment. And in the environment, the act of wearing is not only a matter of covering the body, of swathing the body in cloth, but also about blurring the boundaries between body and space. So clothes and the unfamiliar relationship between cloth and the body therefore play a significant role in the phenomenology of microgravity. When astronauts and cosmonauts are traveling to the ISS, they have been known to take a mascot with them. And they vary. They're usually soft toys on a little tether, dangling from some part of the rocket. And the purpose of this toy is to evidence the moment when the interior of the cabin first experienced weightlessness. So it's the only object that's not securely strapped down for launch. And as it starts to float in the air, that's when the cosmonauts, who are very, very firmly kind of strapped in, or the astronauts are strapped in, that's how they know that they have become weightless, because they can see it happening with this toy that floats around. And that visible evidence of weightlessness is a cause for celebration. You hear them cheering and celebrating because they've passed this boundary into weightlessness. And so each time weightlessness is evidenced in the cabin through this little mascot, it represents the success of the flight, but also more broadly the continued progress made towards conquering space. So this visible evidence of weightlessness is something that is very much cause for celebration and representative of human achievement and of our future. So that tells us that of space travel lies partly in experience of weightlessness, but also ways that that experience of weightlessness can be visibly evidenced in designed objects. Outside of Earth's gravity, objects behave in ways that are very appealing in their strangeness. And Susan Buckle of the UK Space Agency suggests that part of the pleasure of space travel is that defamiliarization. So it's manifested visibly. Not just the feeling of being weightless, but being able to see that you are weightless and that things that you're interacting with are weightless, so that it can be photographed as well as felt and seen as well as felt. So Buckle describes the importance of visible evidence of weightlessness, particularly on board parabolic flights, where although quite often clothes tend to be quite form-fitting, passengers with long hair often relish the opportunity to just take their hair down and let it flow out, because that is the way that weightlessness is most visibly evidenced in their appearance. Not just the fact that they're floating, but the fact that their hair kind of flies up around their heads. So in this particular image is quite a good example of that. These flight suits are so form-fitting that there isn't room for them to really visibly evidence weightlessness. Whereas loose hair is used as a kind of substitute for clothes that might visibly evidence weightlessness, because that is lacking in the suits that have been given to these passengers. And letting go people's hair, having things flow freely, is a way in which people kind of evidence that experience of weightlessness. Orientation plays a key role in familiarity. We recognize familiar objects when they're presented to us at a familiar angle. So on Earth we expect to see and we recognize objects that are mostly upright, relative to our own orientation, so upright in the same way that we are upright. And that assumption has been fundamental to the design process. When we design an object, we depict them in an upright position. We design them from the front, from the side, from the back. Those key elevation views. And this is particularly true of fashion. When fashion designers illustrate and design clothes, they tend to design them in an upright view, from the front, from the side, from the back. And it's so fundamental to fashion and to fashion design that for more than a century, developments in fashion have been introduced as the new silhouette. So the silhouette is how we define the changing fashions, the shape of a particular fashion. And this image actually represents how we talk about fashion in terms of silhouette, in terms of upright orientation, and these front, side, and back views. This sort of variations on it are used to demonstrate how fashion has changed over time, or the evolution of fashion over time. And the ratio of hip to bust to waist is really used to define eras in fashion history. And that makes sense in part because if we encounter another human when we're walking on Earth, we tend to be standing or walking grounded in the same orientation as the person that we are interacting with. So we are accustomed to seeing these silhouettes in our usual everyday encounters. Tim Ungold has written about the valorization of the upright position, saying that there is a bias of head over heels in an article called Culture on the Ground, which I do highly recommend if anybody's interested. However, when we are weightless, our bodies are rarely seen in elevation view. So we rarely encounter a weightless body in that upright pose. Footage from the ISS shows that the body is more often presented shoulder first or even foot first. Since astronauts don't stand on the same surface as each other, don't even stand at all, they encounter each other potentially from any angle at all. And if you see footage of zero-G flights or onboard spacecraft, you notice how astronauts tend to encounter each other from above, from below, seat first. You see an awful lot of crotches rather than waists. You see all sorts of angles that you don't normally encounter on Earth. And you're more likely to see, for example, the rear of their pants than the front of their torso. So the whole garment is very rarely seen, and it's never seen in full in that upright view. You're more likely to see, say, the shoulder seams than the silhouette. And this is complicated by the fact that weightless bodies don't stand upright in an anatomical posture. Even when astronauts try quite hard to kind of straighten their body out to pose for a photograph, they can't actually present themselves fully in elevation view with an anatomical posture. The weightless body naturally falls into a neutral posture, which is kind of part sitting, almost like a snowboarder's posture, with the knees and the arms slightly bent and floating forward. So the weightless body is never fully erect, because weightless bodies don't stand up. For that reason, the knee and the shin are much more visible than they are generally on Earth, or more prominent than they would be on Earth. So the body is made strange by weightlessness in a way that affects, or needs to affect, our approach to designing the clothes that they're going to wear. It's encountered from different angles and also in different postures. So, thinking specifically about fashion, we're left with several problems arising from assumptions that are made about fashion and design on Earth. The first problem is drape. On Earth, we think about drape a lot when we're designing clothes. It's one of the first things you think about. Is your garment going to be draped, or is it going to be skin tight, or is it going to be some tailored compromise or something between the two? And we think a lot about the weight of fabric. Again, when we're picking a fabric, weight is one of the first things that we look at. And the reason for that is because different weights of fabric drape differently. So weight and drape very much connected. And if you look at definitions of drape, they almost always refer to gravity implicitly, or in some cases actually explicitly, because drape is a product of gravity. Drape happens because gravity is forcing something to almost be weighted towards the Earth. So the way in which we assess the usability or the suitability of fabric for a garment is largely because of how it drapes and its weight, its thickness, and how that drapes differently. And obviously that's going to change in microgravity. Drape on Earth causes the fabric to fall around the body in particular ways, to either expose the natural shape of the body, or to conceal it, to transform it into something else. And it's tested with drape meters. There's little spinning things. You put a bit of fabric on and it spins around to see how or doesn't spin around depending on how you're measuring it, to see how fabric drapes, and that information then provides data to allow people to see how drapey a fabric is. And when you're then designing with clothes, often the process of design becomes about drape, becomes about swathing the body, draping fabric onto the body to see how it hangs, or finding a kind of balance between constraint and drape. So some parts of the garment will be constrained to the body in some way, whereas other parts of the body will be allowed to drape. And that fundamentally is quite a key part of fashion, is finding that compromise between drape and structure. And all of that depends on assumptions that we make about gravity that gives us this downward force. Drape is very much a kind of vertical thing. And there are some key things that these are obviously examples that are quite draped, but even in everyday wear, or what you might see astronauts on board the ISS wearing, even things like t-shirt or something slightly more form-fitting, drapes differently in space. So we can see here a couple of examples of what happens to astronauts' routine wear. This is commercial off-the-shelf clothing. They call it COTS, commercial off-the-shelf clothing, which typically includes polo shirts, sweatshirts, t-shirts, cargo shorts, cargo pants. And these are not clothes that are designed for the weightless environment. Astronauts get to pick what they want from a catalogue, and that catalogue is drawn from usually active wear brands, outdoor wear brands. So they are brands that are designed for activity on Earth. And so these clothes were not designed with space in mind. They weren't designed with weightless in mind. Now, obviously this is wearing all the time they're in space. Astronauts, cosmonauts also wear gravity-loading suits sometimes to protect their bones, to apply pressure and reduce the long-term effects of weightlessness. But what I'm mostly interested in is this routine wear, the everyday clothes. And more commonly, this is what they're worn in. They're wearing their routine wear. And it is just commercially available stuff. As I said, it's kind of sportswear, it's active wear. They are slightly amended before they go up into space. You can see here some Velcro that's been added to the cargo shorts there so that things can be stuck to them, pockets and tools and things can be stuck onto the shorts there. Drawstrings are added as well, because if you're in space for a long time, your body shape changes, you get muscle atrophy, and so your legs tend to get thinner. All the liquid rushes up to your head, so you tend to get broader in the shoulders and in the upper torso there. So people's bodies change shape when they're in space, and as a result, they put drawstrings in so they can tighten their waists and stuff when they need to. And also the other thing they do is they shave the clothes, because lint can just float up into the air and get stuck in a vent or something and cause a fire. So all of these t-shirts, before they've gone up there, will have been shaved by somebody in a safe environment to just get all the lint off, and washed, of course, first to get a bit more off. But the problem you can see here is that the clothes don't actually hang on the body. They kind of surround the body but don't hang on it. So they billow around it, creating almost a kind of bubble. And the collar floats upwards towards the chin. You can see that here. It doesn't sit there. It floats upwards towards the face. And the chest and the shoulders billow outwards, so you appear to have more volume around the shoulders, around the chest. And then at the waist, the hem tends to rise up. You can see that here the hem is not weighted down by gravity. It just kind of lifts up. And often from the back view, that exposes the back. So the back of the lower back tends to get exposed. Often you see this in photos of people on board the ISS. So here's an example of what will happen to a polo shirt that's a bit like those that are currently worn by astronauts. That's a polo shirt worn on Earth, and this is what might happen if you're wearing a polo shirt on board the ISS. You can see on Earth we have these points of contact that are usually everywhere where the body becomes slightly more horizontal than it does elsewhere. So there's a point of contact at the shoulder seams, usually one on the chest there, and the hem hangs generally horizontally. But on the right here, this is polo shirt in microgravity. Fabric floats away from the body, and so you've lost those points of contact at the shoulder and the chest there. And the hem tends to kind of float upwards, particularly at the back, because remember they're in a neutral posture, so their backs are slightly more arched, so that also makes that hem rise up a little bit at the back there. And so it tends to kind of wrinkle. You see quite a lot of wrinkled shirts, not because the fabric is wrinkled, but because there just isn't gravity to hold them flat and to weigh them down, so fabric just kind of rises up and crinkles. So in short, what you've got here on Earth is clothes that hang on the body but in space, clothes that surround the body but are not actually resting on it, not supported by it. And as you can imagine, this effect would be even more pronounced in looser clothing, less pronounced in tighter clothing, because there is less room for the fabric to move away from the body. And the looser the fabric, the more potential it has to billow out and away from the body. Skin-tight clothing, of course, is a way to reduce the effects of gravity, but skin-tight clothing isn't necessarily what everybody wants. And as we saw earlier with the zero-G passengers, they find that those form-fitting flight suits don't actually visibly evidence weightlessness in the way that some people want. Some people want to be able to see things floating. So there already is a problem with some of the stuff that we associate with spaceware as opposed to earthwear. Quite a lot of the space age stuff, or even increasingly garments that are designed for commercial space travel, tend to be skin tight. Partly because it's practical, partly because it imitates the flight suit, and partly just because this was something that was established in the space age. The skin-tight bodysuit was this space age thing, and I don't think we've entirely let go of that yet. This is a flight suit for Spaceport Sweden, designed by Angela McKay, and it's form-fitting. So it solves the problem of fabric billowing outwards, if you consider that to be a problem. And it is the kind of flight suit that was imagined in the space age, just with a little bit more kind of athletic detail added to it there. So it is practical, it's functional, but evidence suggests that that might suit some people but not everybody, because some people want more visible evidence of weightlessness, as we saw earlier. We want the floating toy, we want the floating hair, we want a little bit of that. People are fascinated by this visible effect of weightlessness, and commercial space tourists will want to look weightless. They'll want to take their selfies, they'll want to take their little videos of themselves floating around and their clothes floating around them. They want not only their experience to feel strange, but their clothes to feel strange as well, and made strange by weightlessness. And it provides evidence that they are not just on harnesses, they're actually properly weightless. And so the evidence seems to suggest that people actually will appreciate things that are designed to contribute to the aesthetic of weightlessness, not to mask it in the way that skin-tight clothes would. So there's an argument to be made for embracing billowing fabric and embracing the potential for fabric to move away from the body, not just to be constrained to the body in a way that, yes, might be practical, but actually doesn't contribute to that aesthetic of weightlessness. There's potential for this visual spectacle that will be appealing for people, in the same way that underwater fashion photography is a visual spectacle and is appealing for that reason. Underwater environments are used in the space industry to train astronauts, for example, neutral buoyancy labs, they're called, because the underwater environment is not dissimilar to weightlessness. It's more like weightlessness than anything else we've got on Earth's surface. It's not a perfect replica of the weightless environment, because there is hydrodynamic drag and stuff like that, but it's relatively close. And so you can actually look at underwater photography to get a bit of a sense of what might happen to looser clothing when it's weightless. And here's a nice example of an underwater fashion photography shoot that shows how fabric can billow outwards wherever it's not constrained. In this case, it's constrained at the waist because there's a belt around the waist. And in this case, kind of enhances the ideal feminine form, because it is creating extra volume wherever the fabric is loose, which in this case is around the bust and the shoulders and around the hip there. So there is an opportunity to enhance form, to exaggerate form, which is something that fashion has been doing for many centuries. But in this case, it'll be as a result of weightlessness and billowing, rather than as a result of structure or padding. And one of the things that we notice here is that the length, which we are accustomed to being a vertical measurement, becomes potentially a radial measurement. So a skirt that we measure in terms of its length upwards and downwards, actually, if that is loose fabric, potentially can move outwards. So that vertical measurement can potentially become a radial measurement, as it can float out away from the body that way. So length is no longer a vertical measurement. And volume is added wherever that fabric is not tethered to the body. So tethering and billowing have become the new equivalent to drape and structure. Now, obviously, loose fabric does introduce safety concerns. zero gravity flight operators do say we don't want anything that's going to float in front of your eyes. So there's this balance to be sought between billowing fabric and constrained fabric. And we wouldn't want so much fabric that it's going to make things dangerous. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't embrace billowing fabric and its potential at all, because, well, it's not so much of a safety, it's quite undignified. So the way in which we dress and undress, and also the way in which clothes are designed to accommodate that, is something that also needs to be thought about. That they shave clothes before they go up into space. Flammability is still a concern. They've had a dangerous fire up in space already. They're very concerned about flammability. And mass, because although the weight of fabric is not something we need to worry about when it's weightless, we do have to worry about the cost of transporting things into space. It's very, very expensive to take anything heavy into space, so the mass of a garment is a concern.